Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I thought, and again, it's the first time I'm trying to organize a Zoom meeting. It was a disaster until about 5 minutes to 12. Nobody could log on, but hopefully it works now. I think what we're going to do is just everybody make their own decision whether you want to be muted or not. So let's go for maximum 1 hour of presentation, and then 15 minutes afterwards for any questions. So within the hour, I would suggest if you have questions, then just clarifying or very short questions, but nothing too lengthy if possible. And then we'll leave the longer questions till the end. Does it sound good?
Yeah, that's fine.
And any other questions before we start? No? Okay, Juan Pablo, take it from here. Good luck.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay, so thank you for coming. I know this is the first, so I'm really grateful. I'm going to be presenting today. This paper is together with Michael, and of course it's just a working paper. So any comment, a suggestion, or anything is more than welcome. The paper is called "News from a Kidnapped Society: The Effect of News Coverage on Kidnappings in Colombia." So what we're trying to do is basically understand how media can affect terrorist attacks in general and kidnappings in Colombia in particular. We will be focusing on the effect of news coverage about a potential prisoner exchange program, which was called the Acuerdo Humanitario, in which the government was trying to exchange soldiers, FARC soldiers that were in prison for kidnapped people in the jungle. Okay, that's the basic idea. And I want to start telling you about a bit more about this using a personal story, because at the end of the day, each Colombian or every Colombian has been affected by kidnappings in some way or another. So when I was growing up, when I was first out of Colombia, I went to Belgium to do my master's. Every time I met someone, they asked me, "Hey, how is it being from the same country as Pablo Escobar? How is it being from Pablo Escobar's country?" And at first I was a bit ashamed. It's kind of awkward being asked that. But as time goes by, I actually start thinking about it. And the thing is, well, Pablo Escobar was killed in December 1993. I was born in September of that same year. So I never actually lived in his country. I never grew up in the Colombia of Pablo Escobar. When I was growing up, I was not afraid, or people were not afraid of bombs going out in police stations, as Pablo Escobar used to do. When I was growing up, I was actually scared of being kidnapped or being taken by a rebel group. I was actually scared of the FARC, and people were scared of the FARC, right? That's the situation in which we found ourselves. And just to give you a sense of why this is scary, well, the FARC in general, in our sample period, which I will clarify in a bit, took 213 political prisoners, but out of those 213, only 73 returned home, right? So the rest of them were either killed, or they're missing and no one knows anything about them, or they died of disease in the jungle, or something even worse. So basically, it's not. So of course, when I was growing up, it was kind of scary to me. I didn't understand a lot about it. So one thing that I asked myself, and a lot of people ask themselves, was, well, why do these people go ahead and kidnap? And there's kind of two answers to that. There's an easy answer. Well, the FARC kidnapped for political reasons and for financial reasons. They are a terrorist organization which needed to push for a political agenda, but at the same time, they needed money to fund their terrorist activities, right? So they kidnapped for ransom purposes and for political reasons, okay? That's the easy answer. But when you start thinking about it, that's only a very superficial answer. And there's a deeper question that we will be trying to help us answer today. And that question is, what drives those political kidnappings and those financial kidnappings, right? And the angle we will be taking here in this paper is, well, we're going to be trying to explain those political and financial kidnappings as a function of media coverage about a potential acuerdo humanitario, the prisoner exchange program. The idea being that when the media is talking about this political, this acuerdo humanitario, sorry, there's a push for the acuerdo humanitario in the news, and thus the government is being pressured by the media, and then the FARC can take advantage of this and use it to kidnap more people. Imagine this setting. You're a FARC member, and you hear that the acuerdo humanitario is probably going to be a reality, right? Your intuition is going into the cities or the little towns and kidnap more people, more political prisoners, so you have more bargaining chips to negotiate with the government, right? That's the basic idea, and that's the setup that we're gonna try to explore. Okay, so how do we do this? Turns out there's a period in which a presidential candidate is kidnapped by the FARC, and this drives a lot of media attention to the issue of the acuerdo humanitario, right? So let me show you the setting. The setting is that while this prisoner is kidnapped, a lot of people are going to be talking about this acuerdo humanitario, and we're going to explore how these articles that are being published affect subsequent kidnappings in the days to come. Okay, so let's put the setup in. I'll try to explain the setup here. Imagine we have news articles coming from the biggest newspaper in Colombia. The newspaper is called El Tiempo. And they publish a bunch of articles about the prisoner exchange program, the acuerdo humanitario, and then we observe some kidnappings in the days to come, okay? The thing is, well, there's a lot of endogeneity going on here. We don't really know if the newspaper is actually writing about the kidnappings, because there has been a lot of kidnappings in the past, or rather, we're seeing kidnappings because the paper is talking about it, okay? There's a lot of reverse causality going on, maybe even some omitted variable. We don't know if there's some secretive conversations between the government and the FARC, so we don't really know what's going on. So what we're trying to do is introduce an instrumental variable approach. So we're going to be introducing deaths by natural disasters with the idea that, imagine there's some countries out there, some countries that are relevant for Colombians, countries where a lot of Colombians live, right? We're going to take natural disasters in those countries to see to see how El Tiempo shifts their attention towards those natural disasters when the natural disaster is killing a lot of people. So natural disasters occur, El Tiempo shifts attention towards the natural disasters instead of the acuerdo humanitario, and then we see how the kidnappings reacts in the following. Okay, that's the basic idea. Any questions about what we're trying to do here before we proceed? No? Okay, so that's the basic idea. So now that I kind of presented the setup, I wanted to go deeper into the story. Before that, let me just present you the literature. So what do we know about the effect of media on conflict? So media has proven to be a very powerful factor when determining conflict dynamics. So for example, we know that in this random setup, a single radio station was responsible for a lot of Hutus' death in the Rwandan genocide. That's the paper by David Janitsagwa. We also know that in the absence of violence, media can also create animosity between rival groups. That's the paper of Stefano de la Viña and others. And probably closer to us, there's this paper of Ingar and Morten, which records how Iraqi terrorists attack US bases when there's talk about the US leaving Iraq in media like CNN or something. Okay. Other than that, we know that media can motivate terrorists. That's Jeter, and well, it's Michael's whole research agenda is how media motivates terrorists. But there's also a lot of stuff about media affecting other things. Like for example, fertility decisions. That's the paper, TMTB 16 and Pregnant by La Ferrara and Kearney. There's a lot of literature about how it affects migration choices. That's the paper of Parre and Fasani. And there's some evidence about how it might affect HIV spreads. That's the paper by Vanderjee. So why do we think this is important? Well, we think this is important in this context because the Blattman and Miguel point to a blind spot in our understanding of how media might mold conflict dynamics, especially in a setup like a guerrilla warfare like the Colombian. Okay, so we're trying to fit in the literature by trying to explain how it might affect an ongoing conflict. Okay? So let me just try to explain the setup so we're all very clear. In the beginning, in 1999, we have peace talk conversations between the government and the FARC. These peace talk conversations are called El Caguán because they are held in a municipality called El Caguán. The thing is, at some point, the FARC decided to kidnap the airplane of a senator. They kidnapped the airplane, and with the kidnapping, the president decides to stop the conversations. Okay? And when they decide to stop the conversations, at some point, then presidential candidate Ingrid Betancourt, she decides to go to El Caguán to try to give a sense of tranquility to the municipality. So she goes there, and in her way there, she's intercepted by a checkpoint, a FARC checkpoint, and she is kidnapped. She remains a hostage for almost 6 years, for more than 6 years, until from February 2002 up until July 2008, when she is rescued by the Colombian army. So this period is really important for us because when she was kidnapped, she was such a high-profile kidnappee that a lot of attention was devoted to her. Okay. There's like a chat. I'm actually using a headset, but sorry, is that someone asked me if I could use a headset? But I am. It's just that there's a lot of background noise. Sorry. So going back to it, she was kidnapped, and there was a lot of attention devoted to the issue of the Acuerdo Humanitario, because a lot of the international community wanted to ensure her return back home. And that's really interesting for us because that's what we're trying to exploit. The fact that a lot of people are talking about this Acuerdo Humanitario and are pressuring the government. To complete our setup, she is finally rescued by the military, by the Colombian military, without the Acuerdo Humanitario ever taking place. So that's the beauty of it. There's a lot of talk about the Acuerdo Humanitario, the prisoner exchange program, but it never occurs. Okay. To finish this, she was a presidential candidate. Short after she was kidnapped, there was a new president elected, Álvaro Uribe, and his presidency goes all the way until 2010. Okay, that's basically the setup. I jumped all the way back to the, sorry. Okay, so why Betancourt, you might ask? Why is she so important? Well, let's look at this graph. This graph is the mention of Acuerdo Humanitario in el tiempo, looking at the period. Well, it's a time series of the every mention of the Acuerdo Humanitario in el tiempo from 1995 up until 2018. You can see that it really takes off when she's kidnapped, and it really dies off when she's released or when she's rescued. And that's really interesting to us. Okay? So I already told you the intuition about it, but in a very, let's say, informal way. So let's formalize this intuition a bit. Let's say FARC can choose between some political kidnappings and some financial kidnappings, right? And they have some budget that they must preserve. So we have the price of K, plus the gamma equals beta, which is the budget. And they derive utility from an additive function. So let's say they derive utility from equation 2. You can see it there. Sorry, it's that I cannot point it. So imagine this setup. Imagine you have a kind of risky asset, if you will, that it's the political kidnappings. You don't know if the acuerdo humanitario is going to pay off, but if it does, it's going to be super helpful for you. And there's some kind of safe asset, which is the financial kidnapping, which if you kidnap someone, you're going to get the ransom either way, right? So that's the thing. When you put this stuff together, you get a utility of the form of the equation 3, which you can see there. And if you optimize that, you get equation 4. And the thing about equation 4, as you can see, we are deriving an optimal number of political kidnappings. And if you pay attention to that, you can tell that it is increasing with pi. And pi is the probability of the acuerdo humanitario coming to fruition. So the higher the probability of acuerdo humanitario coming to fruition, the higher the number of political kidnappings you would see. And imagine the probability of acuerdo humanitario being a noisy. Imagine the news about the acuerdo humanitario being a noisy measure of that pi. Okay, so whenever there's a news article going on, it increases that pi, and thus it increases the number of political kidnappings. Maybe it's better with a graph. Okay, imagine you have a utility function u, which is shocked by pi, and then the marginal rate of substitution just shifts a bit, and then you can see there's a trade-off between political and financial kidnapping. Okay, that's the very basic idea of what we're trying to do. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the empirical part of the paper, which is like the majority. We have two types of kidnappings: political kidnappings and financial kidnappings. Political kidnappings are going to be members of the military and public servants, politicians, and financial kidnappings are going to be civilians. Okay, so political kidnappings are being held for the sole purpose of the acuerdo humanitario. Okay, they are only there to be part of the prisoner exchange program, and the financial kidnappings are just there to charge their families for ransom or something. Okay, we're going to be using the data from the Centro de Memoria Histórica, which is basically a think tank here in Colombia, which is in charge with recording the history of how the conflict is going. That's the thing. That's basically. We're going to add some robustness checks using some alternative databases like the global terrorism database, but the Centro de Memoria Histórica is going to be our main source of data. Okay, what do we know? We know how many people are kidnapped, what kind of kidnapping is, and what time they are going to be kidnapped by day. So we have daily kidnappings. Okay. Our data of news coverage is basically all El Tiempo articles. We went ahead and went to the website and scraped all their articles and searched for these term words, which are acuerdo humanitario, canje humanitario, or intercambio humanitario. Those three keywords are basically the same thing, are synonyms that refer to the same idea of a prisoner exchange program. We look for those keywords within those articles, and that constitutes our idea of what the media is talking about, our media data. Okay. What else do we have? We have our instrumental variable, which are deaths by natural disasters in countries that are relevant to Colombia. And what do we consider a country that is relevant to Colombia? Well, we take the 10 countries with the highest number of Colombian residents, other than Colombia itself. What's our rationale behind this? Well, our rationale is that deaths in countries that in which Colombians are living are more important for the Colombian media. Okay, so Colombian media are more interested in reporting about deaths that are occurring in these 10 countries than in any other country. This might seem a bit arbitrary, and it is, of course, and we include a bunch of robustness checks, including several other countries, not just 10, but 15, 20, and we can talk about it later, but that's the basic idea. The basic idea is that when there are people dying in countries that are relevant to Colombians, Colombian media is going to pay a lot of attention to that. And by paying attention to that, they are not going to be paying attention to the news about the Acuerdo Humanitario. Okay? So they are going to be crowding out this thing. We measured this in a log scale, just to take account of the deaths. And yes, that's our idea. This is just some stats of what's going on. We have the number of political kidnappings, the number of financial kidnappings, the number of Acuerdo Humanitario news articles, and the number of disaster deaths. Okay, we have almost one political kidnapping every 10 days. We have 1.17 financial kidnappings every day. That's a lot of financial kidnappings. And we basically have 220 people dying from disasters in these countries every day. Okay. Perfect. So now let's get a bit into the.
Sorry. Can you explain again the ID? So is the average number of people dying in those 10 countries per day?
It's the log of the number of people dying in those countries each day.
So that mean is the average number of the log of the average number of people dying.
No, that means the average number of people dying. The idea is the number of people dying in those countries each day, the log of that. I'm just showing you the average people, the average number of people who died in those countries.
But you will have many zeros, and you can't take the log of 0.
It's log plus 1.
Okay.
Yeah. In the appendix, where we run the same analysis, but using the inverse hyperbolic sign, if you're a bit concerned about the log plus 1, but it's basically the same thing. Okay, so that's basically some stats. Just let's get a bit into the statistics. Let's see how things look. So, if this is true, if news about the deaths of people in other countries are crowding out news about the Acuerdo Humanitario, we should see a decrease in the number of Acuerdo Humanitario news when compared with the deaths. And that's exactly what we're doing here in these two graphs. I'm plotting the number of articles, of news articles, versus the log of deaths. So articles goes into the y-axis, and deaths goes into the x-axis. So this is basically the first stage of our idea. And what we can see here is that there's a very clear negative relation between both, which in the left-hand side graph is a bit scattered because we're not including controls, but in the right-hand side is a bit more tight. What controls are we talking about? We're controlling for day of the week fixed effects, month fixed effects, year fixed effects, and a time trend. Why is that? That is very important because we're dealing with news articles here, okay? And the way a newspaper talks about news is not consistent across day of the weeks or say years. The weekend version of the paper is very different from the Monday version of the paper. And there's an increasing trend of, probably due to digitalization, in which news articles, newspaper are publishing more and more stuff. This I'm going to present a graph about. This is the reason why include controls. There's a lot of heterogeneity between the way the articles are presented, depending on the day of the week, month, or year. Okay, so that's basically the way the reason we include this, and we're going to see these controls matter. Okay, so let's formalize the intuition. Okay, so our first stage is we're just going to be predicting the number of news articles today with disaster deaths today. Okay, the log +1 of disaster. Okay, and we're gonna take those residuals and plot it into the second stage, in which we're gonna be predicting the average number of kidnappings in the next 10 days with the news coverage of today. Okay, I will say that again. We're predicting the subsequent kidnappings, the future kidnappings, with what the media is talking about. Okay, these 10 days are, of course, a bit arbitrary. We are going to be dealing with that later. I'm going to be showing you how it behaves over time. 10 is just the way to show 1 point. But it's you'll be seeing. So,
Juan Pablo, quick question. I think
yeah,
it's
sure.
better to ask this question right here about exclusion restriction. So, like, I know that most of the guerrilla warfare across countries are funded by outside organizations outside the country. And what happens is that there's a natural disaster in a country where there are a lot of Colombians. They might not be able to divert their funds to the Colombian rebel groups, right? Because they might need their funds to bail out themselves. Right. So if there's a flood in, say, I don't know, Venezuela, right, and there's where a lot of Colombians are, then the money that they would have otherwise sent to the rebels will now be used to, bail out the Colombian people in Venezuela.
Well, one thing is I could say to you is that mostly FARC are self-funded. They fund themselves by using drug money and by financial kidnappings. They don't have a lot of international support, if that's your concern.
But they operate in Ecuador and Venezuela as well, right, Juan Pablo?
Sorry.
The FARC also operate in Ecuador and Venezuela.
In the borders, they use the borders as a kind of safe haven, because the Colombian army cannot cross international borders, so they use the borders, but they don't go ahead and I don't know, settle themselves in Quito or in Caracas or something like that. Sorry. So okay. So after this, let's look at the tables that we're doing. So column 1 and column 2 correspond to the graph that I show you later. So column 1 is the log of natural disasters with news without controls, and the second one is with controls. Okay, and it's basically the first stage coefficient. But then we took this and we said, okay, if the first stage coefficient is working so well and it's a very powerful predictor of articles, let's go ahead and put that into a reduced form estimation. And that's what column 3 and 4 are for political kidnappings, and columns 5 and 6 are for financial kidnappings. What we see here is that the more people dying in countries that are important for Colombians, the less political kidnappings we see in the next days, and the more financial kidnappings we see in the upcoming days. Okay, this is just a reduced form estimation. So again, going back to Charles' point, and maybe this is a proper point to talk about it, the exclusion restriction. So every IB paper hinges on the exclusion restriction as a clear, as the most important part of it. It's the untestable. So of course, we cannot test the exclusion restriction directly, but we can maybe go ahead around it and maybe start teasing stuff about the exclusion restriction to check how bad is it, or maybe we can play around with it. That's what I mean. So let's look at two charts idea of maybe there's something going on in another country. Let's look at financial and political kidnappings that same day. Okay, so the idea is that if something is happening that exact day, it might affect political kidnapping. So, for example, if the Colombian government is distracted by the fact that or I don't know. Maybe Tushar's example was a good one. Maybe, I don't know, say Venezuela is funding the political kidnappings, and something happened that day, and they are not able to send aid to the FARC. That should reflect on the political and financial kidnappings of that exact day. If they are expecting some help, they might be stopping that aid might not be there that exact day. Maybe I'm all over the place. Sorry about this. But if it's a media story, well, the media cannot, especially a newspaper, cannot capture what is going on exactly that same day. They will be reflecting on they will be talking about it the next days. Okay, so that's what we are seeing here in column 1 and column 2 and column 4 political kidnappings, and column 3 and column 4 for financial kidnapping. We're seeing that disaster deaths today are basically orthogonal to kidnappings in that same day. Okay, maybe another way to look at it is, okay, let's look at the effect of disaster deaths on news coverage yesterday, conditional news coverage today. And that's what columns 5 or 6 are. And what we see here is that disaster deaths today are not able to predict past news coverage. Okay, so this is by any means is not a test of exclusion restriction, of course, but it gives you a sense that there might not be a lot of stuff going on here. Okay. Anyone has a question about exclusion restriction? That this will be a perfect time to ask it.
So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
all right, sorry. So Juan Pablo, shouldn't you be like, including the T-1 disaster deaths in your specification as well for this table? So the idea is you're claiming that, if something happens today, that'll affect the FARC activity today, but it might take a couple of days for the FARC activity to be affected, right? I mean, they get the money, they plan, and it takes a couple of days to act on it, right? So I would increase the disaster. I would include the disasters in the past 1 week, just as controls, to see that none of them predict political kidnappings and financial kidnappings.
Can do that, definitely. Thank you.
Sorry, Devika.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I could be way off here, but what about other dependent variables that you could account for that would affect the number of kidnappings other than media coverage? For example, a change in the political regime or change in kidnapping laws or enforcements. Does that affect your analysis?
Sorry about that. Okay, so you're saying that there might be a third variable that is affecting kidnappings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, I think it's the case. I think we live in this world of multi-causality, and there might be a lot of stuff driving a kidnapping at the same time. I don't know if that's what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, if there would be another variable that would be affecting kidnappings in a significant manner, then your T statistics, if you have them, would be sort of way off. I mean, have you taken that into consideration? Like your errors would sort of reflect all the other omitted variables, but what if something really significant affects kidnappings?
But only if it affects the disasters.
Exactly. That's the beauty of the IV.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
No, it's perfectly fine. Thank you for asking. Okay. So after getting murdered here for the exclusion restriction, every time you do an IV paper, you brace yourself for this kind of stuff. So let's continue. So let's look at political kidnappings as a function of. of media coverage. So the first two columns basically look at the OLS regression with the endogeneity inside, and the third and fourth column present the IV. Every second column, so the second and the fourth, include the control variables. So I want to stop for a second and look at the OLS regressions and point out that if we were to look at only these regressions, we will find that the media articles decrease kidnappings. And if we were to interpret this coefficients as causal, we will then conclude that media coverage of the Acuerdo Humanitario is actually beneficial for future kidnappings. But then, again, there's a lot of endogeneity going on here. And once we account for that endogeneity through our identification, we find that the coefficient shifts towards a positive coefficient, and we actually find a very robust and a very strong, statistically significant coefficient of positive effect of news articles in kidnappings. Basically, column 4 is our preferred specification, in which we basically say that one extra news article causes an increase of 0.17 average kidnappings in the next 10 days. That's equivalent to 1.7 kidnappings. Considering that we also had like 213 kidnappings in our sample, that's a lot. That's big. Again, well, going into panel B, that's basically the first stage with the one we saw back in the graphs, and we see that in panel C we see a bunch of statistics about the IV, testing the IV. It's basically a very robust instrument. Okay, so this is half of our story. So far, we see that there's a positive effect of kidnapping of media attention on political kidnappings. But what about financial kidnappings? Well, financial kidnappings is basically the other side of the story, and here we find the opposite effect. We find that an increased coverage or an increased number of a higher number of articles decreases the number of financial kidnappings. Okay, so this is very consistent with our idea of a redistribution of resources between these two kinds of kidnapping. So there's a shock of a media shock, and these guys respond by kidnapping more political prisoners and not kidnapping kidnapping less financial prisoners. Okay, so this is what we were talking about. This is how it behaves over time, because of course we were in the past tables, we're just looking at the effect on the average 10 days, but this is kind of arbitrary. So what we do here is we allow for this time window to be different, and this is what we're seeing here. So what we find is that the effect is increasing. It starts to increase up until day 12 to 14. And then it starts decreasing back again until it gets to a well-identified 0 in the day 100. Okay, this is for political kidnappings. When we start looking at financial kidnappings, we find ourselves with this. It starts increase and goes back, it peaks again in the day 12, 14, but it lingers for way longer, almost 3 months. We were a bit puzzled by this the first time we saw it, but then we found this anecdotal evidence showing that financial kidnappings could take way longer, just because it takes a lot of time to do research on the person you're trying to kidnap. It might take it's not like you're kidnapping some police officer that is just in the street. You're probably kidnapping someone who is wealthy, who might have security, and you might need a plan, and so it takes longer. So once you shock that, the effects linger for way. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Simon here. All right. So in these two figures, I noticed that the confidence intervals keeps shrinking the longer after the articles was published.
Yes.
So your estimation become more and more precise the longer into the, in the future or whatever you said. So do you have any explanation for this?
Actually, I haven't thought about it, but it might be a very good idea to think why the confidence interval starts shrinking. Thank you for that.
Are these newest West standard errors?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are estimated using.
That could be the reason.
Oh, of course. Yeah, it's a time series. The more information you give them. Yeah, maybe I'll have to talk to you about it, and maybe you'll give me some feedback about it.
One comment about the argument that you made about financial kidnappings taking more time to plan.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's not such a strong statement, right? Because think about political kidnappings. These are either police officers, so they actually live with, or they have police forces around them, or they are political leaders, so they will also have security around them, right? So I'm not saying that, you should not distinguish between the two, but maybe find another argument. This one people can attack you on.
That's that's a good idea. Is that for? Well, I'll tell you anecdotally how this political kidnappings occur. Most of them. What happens is that they kidnap policemen and soldiers. So what they do is that they make these fake phone calls, telling them that there's a criminal, I don't know where, and there's like a patrol that shows up, and the patrol is just like three policemen that showed up, and these guys just bring up the AK-47s and, hey, you're under arrest, you're going to the jungle. So it's easier for them just to call the police to show up in the middle of nowhere than to kidnap a wealthy person. Is that what I meant? But it's a good point. Thank you.
But if the police is not preparing for that ambush after a couple of incidents, then the police is being stupid.
Well, but the point is, you could think, yeah, it's actually true, but it's difficult for the policemen to, for example, say, I don't know, they receive a call from a lady telling them that their husband is beating them, right? And they show up like two policemen to attend a case of family violence, right? And all of a sudden they find themselves surrounded by, I don't know, 10 guys with heavy machinery and, well, this kind of.
Yeah, makes sense.
But thanks. So going on. So we were doing this. We were asking ourselves, well, what's driving this kidnappings? We know that there's an effect, a media effect. That media is the one causing all these kidnappings. What is it about this article? What is it about this coverage specifically that is driving this kidnappings? Because, well, hopefully I convince you that media is the one that is causing this, but what is it about the articles? So we posit that there's probably several mechanisms going at play. There's an information mechanism that probably these guys know something about the political discussion of the Acuerdo Humanitario, but using the news to inform them, or maybe it's just the public discourse that is pressuring the government and they are using this political pressure. So we wanted to distinguish between these possible mechanisms. So what we do is go ahead and analyze the text. Pretty much what similar to what the monetary policy literature does with the Fed extras. So how is the Acuerdo Humanitario portrayed in El Tiempo? Because if El Tiempo is not being supportive of the Acuerdo Humanitario, it's very difficult to buy the idea that they are being pressured, well, that the government is being pressured by El Tiempo. Right? So we manually divide each news article into three buckets. In the first bucket, we have positive news, or well, what we call positive news, which are news that are indicative of the Acuerdo Humanitario coming to fruition, so they speak well of the possibility of the Acuerdo Humanitario being realizing. Then we have neutral news, which they are not very informative, they are just neutral. And then we have negative news, which communicate a negative possibility of the Acuerdo Humanitario coming to fruition. So they tell that the Acuerdo Humanitario is not realized. That's what we meant. And what we see is that there's overall, over the whole period of time, there's a higher number of positive news than compared to negative news. So this kind of shows the overwhelming support that El Tiempo gave to the Acuerdo Humanitario. Okay? So if El Tiempo is supportive of the Acuerdo Humanitario, well, this is only showing us that they speak well about it. But it's important to know who are they putting in the spotlight, okay? Who are they calling for the Acuerdo Humanitario? So we went ahead and took the most used words, both for the titles and subtitles of the news. And we see that, for example, for the subtitle, we have FARC, president, government, Uribe, which is the president, hostages, Chavez, which is Venezuela's president. Yesterday, Alvaro, which is Alvaro Uribe, Colombia's president, release, and guerrillas. So out of these 10 words, 6 of them are directly putting in the spotlight the government or the FARC, right? So they are not focusing on the Acuerdo itself, but they are pressuring the government to find an agreement with the FARC. And that's very interesting because it tells us that they are putting a lot of pressure into them, okay? So it's interesting to us to look at, well, we know what kind of news we're dealing with, and we know what they are doing with these news. But let's have some kind of sentiment analysis about this news. So in the dark blue line are the Acuerdo Humanitario news. The light blue line are the other FARC news, other FARC related news, and the red line is all the other news by El Tiempo. What we find in this sentiment analysis is that the Acuerdo Humanitario news include way more social attitudes. They tend to have a higher cognitive process, and they are highly emotional compared to other news. And when compared to other FARC news, they are more positive. Okay, so this tells us that they are completely different news compared to other kind of news. And they are more social and more emotional. And this is consistent with the idea that these news articles are opinion pieces or op-eds, okay? So if these news articles are opinion pieces rather than actual news, we can begin to imagine that most of them are being just people putting opinions out there, pressuring the government towards the idea of the Acuerdo. So we probably conclude that maybe it has a lot to do with the political pressure towards the government and not so much about the information, okay? This is work in progress, of course, but it's the idea that we get from these kind of news, okay? So our results are robust to other data sources. For example, instead of using the kidnapping data from the Centro de Memoria Histórica, we use data from the Global Terrorism Database, and it's robust. We use different time periods, for example, including different political regimes, it's still robust. We use different measures of disaster intensity using the Richardson scale instead of deaths. We include controls for past kidnappings. We include different operationalizations of the instrument. We check for autocorrelation and dependent variable. We control for the opposing kinds of kidnappings. We take out each country in the instrument one at a time to check if it's still robust. We take each type of disaster from our instrument to see if it's being driven by any one kind of disaster. And we include different cutoff points for the number of Colombians in our instrument. They are all robust. I'm happy to discuss them if you will, but I just decided to put them in just one graph because it's a lot of stuff going on. Okay? So, just to recap, we have this trade-off effect going on between political kidnappings and financial kidnappings. So when media starts talking about the political, about the acuerdo humanitario, sorry, we see that there's this trade-off between political and financial. And the acuerdo humanitario raises the likelihood of kidnappings in the following weeks up to 100 days for the political kidnappings, and up to 2 or 3 months for the financial, which is a substantial period of time, and it's very informative because the literature is not very familiar with how many days it might take. So talking about Batman and Miguel, going back to the initial question, that now we're presenting quantitative evidence showing that media coverage may encourage rebel or terrorist groups to commit violent attacks, in this case kidnapping, which is substantial. Our main takeaway, what we would like to provide, is a message of there's with great power comes great responsibility. Okay, so media outlets should be more careful of about what they're putting out there, and they should be willing to include self-censoring practices in order to avoid this kind of problems. There's a lot of ethical implications going on once you know that what you put out there is having consequences. It's very ironic to think that the very same people you're trying to get out of the jungle by using these opinion pieces, you're putting people there by using these opinion pieces. So it's quite ironic. And that's the thing. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo.
Thank you.
Questions?
Any questions?
Can I raise a point, Michael, here? What about the counterfactual, that what the newspaper would look like if the government had toughed it out and didn't effectively introduce measures that are going to encourage political kidnapping? I mean, the removal or the eradication of kidnapping would presumably be politically massively positive. The sentiment, the long-term sentiment of that would be huge. And a rational government looking at the longer term, maintaining themselves in government over a long period, would presumably be looking at those, the counterfactual potential benefit of not rewarding political kidnapping.
Sorry, Michael, can you say that again? I kind of lost you for a second.
Yeah, I was just raising a counterfactual point. You're talking about the link to the sentiment, the positive sentiment that is generated through the media when there's been a effective rewarding of kidnapping. My point is that the positive sentiment that would emerge, it hasn't, but would emerge in the media if the government had introduced policies that were very strict and didn't reward kidnapping, the longer term benefit may be huge, and the positive sentiment generated in the press in this counterfactual world may even be greater. So, I mean, surely a government would be thinking rationally about it in that context too, in that longer term context.
Sorry, I don't think I'm getting your point. Your point is that a positive sentiment in the news might encourage future kidnapping.
Yeah. I'm saying that there would be a positive reaction in the news if political kidnappings were eradicated. Now that might mean foregoing all the positive sentiment that your graphs are generating between dealing with people who have kidnapped people politically. But if you acted in the longer term and just foregone those shorter term benefits and said the long term benefit of eradicating political kidnapping is greater, surely that's what a long term looking government would try and do.
Long-term dynamic. When you say eradicating political,
what I'm saying is they would ignore all the sentiment that you're referring to. You're saying government's power. With great power, there comes great responsibility. The media needs to be very careful because it's going to force or influence a government to do certain things. I'm saying whether the government has a longer term perspective and it would be conscious of what the sentiment across the whole community would be if it took a tough line in the short period and didn't reward kidnapping and in the process eradicated it.
Oh, but that's exactly what the government did. Not paying. Well, the government never really went ahead and had this program. It's just there was just a lot of talk about it, but there were not actual trades, prisoner trades.
Okay, so I've misinterpreted that part. I incorrectly assumed that it went ahead.
It did. That's actually one of the reasons where it's kind of a nice setup. This because the Acuerdo Humanitario never materialized. So there was a lot of talk about it, but it never really went ahead.
Okay. Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
I think Rico had a question.
Yeah, Pablo, I just typed in my question before. Was it on your final slide? You had the result, the one with the elephants. You were saying that the FARC is affected by the AH news, but I'm just confused how that fits in with your earlier narrative about how they don't actually see these news articles. I'm just wondering how that squares off, or if I've misinterpreted something there.
Well, the elephant thing is that we see whenever there's news about the financial about the Acuerdo Humanitario, we see this trade-off between political and financial kidnappings. That's what I refer to the elephants. Well, it's just
so the AH news is somehow supposed to affect the behavior of the FARC, though? Or is it just a proxy for what's happening in terms of sentiment?
It is. No, it's actually, what we're dealing with here is the actual effect of news on the FARC.
But my question is, how do they receive that news if they don't have access to written media, which I understood was the case because you looked at the whole paper with the radio access?
Well, the radio thing is another paper, but imagine this. Soldiers, individual soldiers are not the ones taking decisions about going around and kidnapping people, right? They take orders from their superiors, and their superiors, they do have access to written media. Also,
yeah, that makes sense.
Also, imagine this: El Tiempo as a proxy for media attention. Of course, they are not only reading El Tiempo; they might also be, I don't know, listening to the TV or the radio or whatever. But it's a very good proxy of media attention.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Tushar?
Pablo.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Nick, you go. Yeah.
Hello.
Just a much more mundane question, and that is, what about the prominence of the news article? Whether they're large or small, whether they're long, or what page or what position in the newspaper they're in, and so on. You would think that would have an influence?
I do think it would have an influence, but sadly, since we scraped the website, it's not possible for us to check the position of each individual news article within the paper. So it would be a great idea if we could do that, but sadly we can't.
Oh, okay. Just put me in a footnote.
But length we could look at, Juan Pablo.
Length, oh yeah. Length we have, yes.
Good point. Yeah. Tushar, I think.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions. So the first one is, you're talking about these two mechanisms, but could there be a third one where basically, everyone's reading about this AH news, and people, civilians and political, political entities, they become lax in their effort to prevent kidnappings? So there's a moral hazard problem. I know that there's a possibility that if I get kidnapped now, I might be traded off for a prisoner. So I will not go out with as much security as I would in the past. So the moral hazard problem, right? So could that be a possibility? The other one I had was, when you say there's a trade-off between financial and political kidnappings, I mean, the first thing that would be nice to see would be that the total number of kidnappings remains somewhat, remain the same, right? So I know that obviously you have different costs of doing these two kidnappings, so that might not be the best comparison. But if the total number of kidnappings is not the same, if it's overall number of kidnappings is going up, then that's saying something different. That's saying that, perhaps the situation has changed and it has become easier to do any kind of kidnapping, and political kidnapping is perhaps what they prefer. Third one, so you are using the AH news as your X variable, right? But
Yes.
natural disasters in other countries will affect all kinds of news in the newspaper, right? It won't just take away space for AH news, it will take away space for all kinds of news that is FARC related or otherwise. So could it be that other kinds of news are influencing it? It's just that FARC is getting less attention in these periods, and therefore they can go on a rampage, right? So yes, so those were the questions.
Okay, so the first question was about the third mechanism. The third mechanism, which was
moral hazard, right? I mean,
the moral hazard.
If I'm somehow insured about the loss, I will be more likely to commit the wrong, do the wrong thing.
The thing is, well, I think that helps us here is that the Acuerdo Humanitario never actually came to fruition, right? So there was never an exchange of prisoners. So for you to believe that you could go ahead and go outside and eventually you will get traded, it's kind of risky because it never happened.
Yeah, it is,
right?
for sure. It is for sure. But I mean, if you're claiming that the FARC rebels were affected by the news in their actions, then you could also claim that civilians will be affected by the news in their actions. Right? Why should it have different implications for the civilians and the FARC rebels?
I do agree that there might be an effect on civilians, but I'm finding hard to agree with the thing that maybe there's a moral hazard. I think no one will like to be kidnapped.
Yeah, sure. So then if you want to make that claim, then you need contextual information, right? So somehow show us that it did not change how careful civilians were or political entities were in their efforts to prevent kidnappings.
Fair enough. The second one is about the total number of kidnappings, right?
Yeah.
It's a very good point. I'll have to go back and check the total number of kidnappings, but we have to keep in mind that there's a higher number of financial kidnappings, both because they don't have to be kidnapped for so long, and because they usually get released very quickly. You've kidnapped someone, you ask for a ransom, the ransom is paid fairly quickly, and then it's released. But I definitely can check that out. But I wanted just to tell you a bit about the story. And the third one, can you remind me of the third one?
Yeah, so natural disaster news will take away coverage from all kinds of news. It'll compete with all kinds of news, not just AH news.
Yes.
And therefore, if overall FARC activity is getting less attention in the news articles, they can go on a rampage without having the same kind of repercussions. Right? So I know that the newspapers will be busy covering natural disasters. So even if I do something wrong, it will not receive as much spotlight as it would have in the past. Right? So I can go and commit more crime.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I can check the other kind of activities. But overall, if you take a look at the magnitude of the effects, since we have way more financial kidnappings, we have a reduction in the overall number of kidnappings in general. But it's a good point.
I think Chris had a question.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm battling a chainsaw outside at the moment. Just to add on to what Tushar said earlier, certainly, even if the FARC don't get finances from abroad, that's where they sell all their cocaine, and they definitely get a lot of money from selling cocaine. And I would think that natural disasters definitively have an impact on both shipping of cocaine, but also then the subsequent distribution of cocaine. And it also is the case that those countries where there's a lot of Colombians, Colombia also sells a lot of cocaine to those countries. So I worry a little bit about your exclusion restriction, or that you can perhaps do a little bit more in terms of excluding perhaps those countries that you are including in that group. But I'm sure you've done lots of robustness.
Yes, if I go back into the number of robustness, well, there's a robustness in which we look at, where is it? We take out each country one at a time to look if it still holds, right? You're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure how sufficient just dropping a single country would be.
Okay. Well, okay. So for this to be
think about Hurricane Mitch, 1987. And your sample probably starts a lot later, but I mean, that had such a huge impact for a long time across Honduras, across Guatemala, across basically how the cocaine shipped from Colombia to North America. Hurricane Katrina, it would have affected one market a lot, significantly, but not all natural disasters are created equally. And some of these large natural disasters, like major hurricanes, will, I suspect, have had an impact, at least in the short run, over a certain number of days.
Okay.
Sorry, just to clarify what I mean on the price of cocaine and therefore on the price of kidnapping.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. But then there's a lag problem. Wouldn't you agree that a shock to the cocaine demand would take some time to realize in the Colombian producers? And we're exploring very short-term dynamics here.
I don't know, because my understanding is that Colombia produces as much as they physically can and that it exports as much as they physically can. And then they just accept that quite a few of the shipments are going to get caught, but they're sending so much out, they're going to basically get away with it. And then sometimes there are massive seizures, which have somewhat of an impact. And then other times, I'm sure, little planes, little boats get lost at sea, etc., because of these major unexpected events. So I'm not sure.
Okay.
How long it would take to feed through.
Probably let's look at this, for example. This is an exercise in which we take each kind of disasters one at a time. So for example, major disasters, for example, like I don't know, earthquakes or I don't know, landslides or kind of stuff. If we start taking each kind of disaster one at a time, it's still robust. Maybe it helps, but maybe it doesn't. And maybe we could check something about potential demand shocks.
Can you not look at the impact of natural disasters on the price of cocaine?
The thing about cocaine prices is that they are updated not on a regular basis. Like, let's put it like that.
So it's not like the oil price.
Exactly. It's not like looking for the price of, I don't know.
It's curious. He found that they do less financial kidnapping. If there was a shock in the income from cocaine, they would be doing more financial kidnapping.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Yeah. I think Girish had another question.
Yeah, just a quick one. So, one, the thing is that this is regarding your IV. Now, if in case, if you look at a news article or I don't know anything, a newspaper, and if all events are competing to be in a particular, in a segment because of the intensity of the event, okay? If a news basically deserves mention in an article because it's important enough, and if there is then these natural disasters that are clearly more important than probably some local kidnappings, then what's really happening is that the events, it's not that the event is not happening, it's that just because they're not that important, they're not being covered in the news. So my question is it simply the intensity of your news events that's actually creating the variation in X? The Y is not really changing. It's just that the X is not really being reported because more important things were being reported. And then you're finding a spurious effect on the fact that, X is leading to a higher Y. It's just a, mean reversion, nothing else.
Well, to just add very briefly to that, have you looked at what happens immediately prior to the period? Because if there's like an Ashton Felter dip or something like that, then mean reversion is probably more of a candidate.
We looked at the effect of deaths today on disaster yesterday, but I don't think.
But do you see my point? Do you see?
Yes, I see. I'll definitely check it up. Because yes, I see your point. Yes, I'll definitely check something. We'll check different kind of news and see how they are being crowded out by the effect. It might be interesting to look at.
Okay, the hour 15 are up, but given that nice online forum now, I'd say whoever has other questions, hang on, and I think Juan Pablo will be around for a bit longer to have a chat, but officially I think we can stop the seminar here. So thank you very much, Juan Pablo. Thanks to everyone who attended, and as usual, any questions, comments you have, just contact Juan Pablo by email, and yeah, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, and thank you for all your comments and being here and everything. It's just great.
That being said, if anybody else has other questions now, go for it.
Pablo, I have another question.
Yeah, sure.
I was wondering about to what extent the AH news articles, I mean, you mentioned a lot of them are op-ed pieces, but are any of them, you can just give some indication, are any of them in response to previous kidnappings? Like, are they spurred by a kidnapping that's happened the week before and then they want to talk about this policy because of that previous kidnapping? Or is it just an independent opinion piece based on sentiment at the time? Because that might be an important thing to look at.
You mean like that's exactly the endogeneity that we're trying to deal with. Where at the beginning when I was telling this is that we don't actually know what's driving what, and that's why we introduce the IV, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
A question precisely about the endogeneity. Because yes, I mean we see that we have more kidnappings. I mean the variable on the left here, the news, is a proxy for the probability that this agreement is approved. Am I right?
You could say it as a noisy indication of the probability. Yes.
So it maps into the P variable in the theoretical model, correct?
Into the pi, yes.
Okay, exactly. But now we are saying here in the endogeneity, I mean, in the model, in the theoretical model, the motivation, the P is fixed. It's exogenous. The FARC has no control over that P. But now in the endogeneity, you are telling me that this P is endogenous. I can have some control. So maybe.
Oh, what I'm saying is endogenous is pi, not P. Like a pi, the probability pi, not the price P. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. That's endogenous, but in this model, it's exogenous.
Oh,
so
well, this is about
I mean, my only concern is, in order to send it to a journal, you might want to consider a different motivation here theoretically. Because the theoretical model says the opposite that the endogeneity problem you are telling me in the empirics. That's all.
With the theoretical model, well, we're just trying to represent FARC's thought process, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
we're not trying to represent the whole interaction between the kidnapping and stuff. We're just trying to provide an insight on what might be driving the kidnapping decision by the.
I see your point, and it's fantastic that you have a theoretical model that guides your empirics. But to see what I was seeing at the presentation, I was saying, oh, wait a second. In the theoretical model, the probability is exogenous, but then in the empirics, it's endogenous. That's all.
Yeah, that's a good point. We need to think about that.
Hi, Pablo. Are you controlling? Hi. Are you controlling for FARC prisoners taken by the government during this period?
We're not, but it might be a good idea.
Because if media coverage is directed more towards the natural disasters, that may be correlated with government like offering support for Colombians overseas or occupied with other things and not taking like actively pursuing the operations against FARC and thus not taking a lot of their prisoners. And if these kidnappings are in revenge of the operations that the government does against FARC, then that would be affected by both, that would be affected by natural disasters through this channel. I'm not sure if I did it. So do you want me to repeat?
Please.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so if there are natural disasters, then the government may be involved in providing relief services for Colombians overseas or monitoring them or whatever, and may not actively pursuing operations against FARC, which means if these kidnappings are in revenge for the operation against FARC, that should go down. The kidnappings should go down.
So what you're thinking about is maybe the government is distracted providing aid to other countries and FARC take the opportunity to kidnap people.
No. I'm saying if FARC is kidnapping political people in response to the operations of the government against FARC, then that revenge should automatically go down because government is busy elsewhere and not actively conducting the operation against FARC.
Yeah.
So if you have data available on that, I'm not sure, like the number of.
Oh, we do. We can actually check that. But
it's just like an additional control.
It's actually a very good point. But one thing that I would say is that most of these countries are like the US, Spain, are big countries which usually don't get aid from Colombia. It's maybe the other way around.
It's not just the aid. It's like if there is a big event and like I'm thinking of Pakistanis. If there are a lot of Pakistani people, then government has to like provide resources like the information that they gather about them and give them back to their families in the country and everything. Like it's not just about the money, but the engagement that the government has to do for facilitating.
Good point.
Good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anything else?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course.
So I am just a little uncomfortable with the last Spider-Man slide.
Because of Spider-Man?
Which is that with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes.
And for me, I think if that is the conclusion, I mean, if I were to ask you what should news channels do, you know, anyone would say that yes, they should act more responsibly. So I'm getting the fact that your analysis is very pointed towards FARC and kidnappings and the news coverage, but the conclusion that you're drawing is extremely general.
Well, it's general into the Colombian sense, but Michael is more familiar with this kind of questions with his research on Al-Qaeda and kind of stuff.
Yeah, you're right. This is a fairly general slide. It could be interpreted in a bunch of ways. What it could be, maybe what would be better is just say, look, we're telling media sources now what you report there might actually lead to inadvertent consequences. So maybe be careful if you talk about just rumors of that potential prison exchange becoming a reality, and then you might actually cause damage in terms of more people being kidnapped. So yeah, it should be more precise. That's true, because it's a very sensitive topic when it comes to press freedom.
Because I come from India, and in India also there are a lot of news channels which partake in spreading rumors about the government, against the government, for, and so on. And you know, that's the general talk saying that the media should be more responsible in what they're reporting. Yeah. That's all.
Yep.
Yes.
Good point.
It's just yes. Agree. Especially nowadays where there's a lot of talk, for example, in the US about censoring the media.
Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, maybe in response.
Oh, please don't talk about the theoretical model. Please don't.
It's actually not. It's in response to this moral hazard issue.
Oh, so, yeah. The one to Charles mentioned?
Yes. So let's just think about it the other way around. And that could actually strengthen all your arguments. So it could be that potential political kidnappees hear about kidnappings, poor detention conditions, and so on. Mm-hmm. So they would be aware about kidnappings and they would be perhaps be more fearful. That creates some incentives for them to take actions like tracking, personal security, cameras, and that even for cops. So that increase actually the cost of kidnappings from FARC's point of view. And what you find is that FARCs are kidnapping people in spite of this cost increase. So all the measures you find, if that is true, are actually just lower bounds. And so your argument is actually, well, the effect could actually be stronger.
It could be either direction, but we have to talk about that. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
Other questions? Going once? Twice? All right, let's end it here then. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. Thanks to everyone who attended.
Thank you. Thank everyone for coming.
Speak to you soon.
Thanks, Pablo.
Well, I mean, I'm just clapping with his mic off, but okay.
Thanks, Emiliano. Bye, guys. Thank you.
See you. Thank you very much.